The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Henderson as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her civilian clothes one last time before stepping out of her car. After 18 months deployed overseas, she was finally coming home to take command of the base she had trained at 15 years ago as a young lieutenant. Now, at 37, she carried the weight of 3 stars on her shoulders and the responsibility of leading 12,000 soldiers. She had deliberately chosen to arrive in casual clothes rather than her dress uniform. The surprise inspection wasn't scheduled until next week, but Sarah believed in seeing how things really operated when no one was putting on a show. Her promotion to general had been kept quiet from the base personnel, and she wanted to observe the real atmosphere before making her presence known officially. The base entrance came into view, and Sarah's heart swelled with pride and nostalgia. The same guard towers stood sentinel, the American flag snapped crisply in the morning breeze, and the familiar sound of boots on pavement echoed from the nearby training grounds. This place had shaped her into the soldier she became, and now she would shape it for the next generation. As she approached the main gate, Sarah noticed a group of young recruits gathered near the visitor processing center. They were obviously new, their uniforms still held crisp creases, their boots gleamed with fresh polish, and they carried themselves with the mixture of nervousness and bravado that marked soldiers fresh out of basic training. She remembered that feeling well. "Ma'am, you'll need to stop at the visitor center for processing," called out one of the gate guards, a young corporal who couldn't have been more than 22. His voice was professional but carried the slight uncertainty of someone still learning the ropes. Sarah nodded and headed toward the small building where visitors checked in. As she walked, she could hear the recruits talking among themselves, their voices carrying the casual confidence of youth mixed with the need to prove themselves to their peers. "I'm telling you, Johnson, I could take down any officer on this base," boasted a tall recruit with sandy hair and broad shoulders. His name tape read Martinez and he gestured wildly as he spoke. "These desk jockeys don't know real combat. They've been sitting behind computers while we've been training hard." "Come on, Martinez," replied another recruit, this one shorter but stockier, with the name Peterson visible on his uniform. "You can't just go around challenging officers. That's a good way to get yourself court-martialed." "I'm not talking about challenging them officially," Martinez laughed, flexing his arms dramatically. "I'm talking about if it came down to it, real fighting, no rank involved. Just skill against skill. I bet half these officers couldn't handle a real fight." Sarah paused, genuinely curious about where this conversation was heading. She had encountered this type of bravado before, young soldiers who confused physical strength with military prowess, who hadn't yet learned that leadership required far more than the ability to throw a punch. A third recruit, a young woman with the name Thompson on her uniform, shook her head at her colleagues. "You guys are idiots. Do you have any idea what officers go through to earn their commissions? They don't just hand out ranks to people who can't handle themselves." "Please," scoffed Martinez. "My cousin told me about his base. Said most of the female officers were just diversity hires who couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. Bet that's true here too." Sarah felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest. She had faced this attitude throughout her career, the assumption that her gender made her weak, that her rank was somehow unearned. She had proven herself time and again, from her early days as a second lieutenant leading patrols in Afghanistan to her recent command of a special operations task force in Syria. The 3 bronze stars and Purple Heart in her apartment spoke to combat experience that would humble most of these recruits. "You know what?" Martinez continued, his voice getting louder as his audience grew. "I bet I could take on any female officer on this base. Hell, any officer, period. These college boys and girls don't know what real fighting looks like." Thompson stepped closer to Martinez, her voice sharp. "That's enough, Martinez. You're embarrassing all of us with this garbage." "Embarrassing?" Martinez laughed. "I'm being honest. Look, I respect the uniform and the chain of command, but let's be real about who could actually handle themselves in a real situation." Sarah made her decision. She had originally planned to observe quietly, but this conversation was revealing exactly the kind of attitude problem that could poison unit cohesion and undermine military effectiveness. Sometimes leadership meant confronting problems head-on, even when you weren't in uniform. She approached the group with measured steps, her posture relaxed but confident. Years of command presence couldn't be hidden, even in civilian clothes. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice carrying the subtle authority that came from years of giving orders that meant life or death. The recruits turned toward her, and Martinez's expression shifted to one of mild annoyance mixed with the automatic politeness that basic training had drilled into them when addressing civilians. "Yes, ma'am? Can we help you?" "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," Sarah said, keeping her tone neutral and friendly. "It sounded like you were discussing military leadership and combat effectiveness." Martinez's chest puffed out slightly, clearly pleased to have an audience for his theories. "Yes, ma'am. We were just talking about how some people get promoted based on politics instead of actual ability. No offense if you work on base or anything." "None taken," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "I'm curious about your perspective. You mentioned that you don't think female officers could handle themselves in a real fight. What makes you so confident about that?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere dangerous, but Martinez seemed oblivious to any potential problems. "Well, it's just biology, isn't it? Men are stronger, faster, more aggressive. In a real combat situation, those advantages matter. I've been training martial arts since I was 12, and I've never met a woman who could match what I can do." "Interesting theory," Sarah said thoughtfully. "And you feel this applies to all female officers, regardless of their background or experience?" "Pretty much," Martinez said with a shrug. "I mean, I'm sure they're smart and good at planning and stuff, but when it comes to actual fighting, they'd fold under pressure." Thompson looked mortified by her colleague's words, but Martinez seemed to be gaining steam rather than recognizing the danger he was walking into. Sarah had to admire his confidence, even as she planned to thoroughly dismantle it. "What about you?" Sarah asked, turning to the other recruits. "Do you all share Martinez's perspective?" Peterson looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole, while Thompson spoke up firmly. "No, ma'am. I think Martinez is wrong and, frankly, out of line. My sister is a Marine captain, and she could probably take down half the guys in our training company." "Your sister's different," Martinez protested. "She's probably one of those rare exceptions. I'm talking about the average female officer. Bet most of them have never even been in a real fight." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying that if a female officer were here right now, you'd be confident you could outfight her?" "Absolutely," Martinez said without hesitation. "Not that I'd ever challenge an officer officially, of course. I respect the chain of command. But, in a hypothetical situation where rank didn't matter? Yeah, I'd be confident. Even if she had extensive combat experience?" Sarah pressed. "Experience helps," Martinez admitted, "but it can only make up for so much. Physical advantages are physical advantages." Sarah felt the familiar calculation that preceded any tactical decision. She could walk away, report this conversation to the appropriate officers, and let the normal disciplinary channels handle Martinez's attitude problem. That would be the safe, by-the-book approach. Or she could use this as a teaching moment that these recruits would never forget, a lesson about assumptions, respect, and the dangers of underestimating anyone based on appearance. The choice became clear when she noticed other soldiers beginning to gather, drawn by the increasingly animated conversation. Word would spread about Martinez's comments regardless of what she did. The question was whether that word would reinforce his misconceptions or provide a valuable lesson about the realities of military service. "You know," Sarah said conversationally, "I happen to know a female officer who might be interested in your theory." Martinez's eyes lit up with interest rather than alarm. "Really? Someone on this base?" "You could say that," Sarah replied. "In fact, she should be arriving any minute now. Would you be interested in discussing your ideas with her directly?" "Sure," Martinez said eagerly. "I mean, I'd be respectful about it, obviously. But, yeah, I'd be happy to explain my position." Thompson grabbed Martinez's arm. "This is a bad idea. You need to shut up before you get yourself in serious trouble. Martinez shook her off.
Relax, Thompson. I'm not going to be disrespectful.
I just think it's important to have honest conversations about military effectiveness.
Sarah almost felt sorry for the young man.
His confidence was genuine, his intentions weren't malicious, but his assumptions were about to collide with reality in a way that would reshape his entire perspective on military service. She had been underestimated her entire career, and, while it had been frustrating and sometimes infuriating, it had also given her certain advantages. People who underestimated her were usually unprepared for what she was actually capable of.
Excellent, Sarah said. Why don't we wait here for her? I think you'll find the conversation educational. As they stood near the base entrance, Sarah observed the dynamics among the recruits. Martinez continued to hold court, clearly energized by what he saw as an opportunity to prove his point.
Peterson looked increasingly nervous, his military instincts apparently warning him that something was off about this entire situation. Thompson had given up trying to reason with Martinez and was simply shaking her head in disgust. The morning sun climbed higher, and the base came alive around them.
Soldiers jogged past in formation, their cadence calls echoing off the nearby buildings. Officers in dress blues walked purposefully toward the administrative complex, briefcases in hand and ribbons gleaming on their chests.
It was a scene Sarah had witnessed thousands of times, but seeing it again after so long overseas filled her with a deep sense of homecoming.
So what branch is this officer in? Martinez asked, clearly trying to gather intelligence for his upcoming encounter.
Army, Sarah replied truthfully.
Combat experience?
Extensive, Sarah said with a slight smile.
Multiple deployments, various combat roles. Martinez nodded approvingly. Good. I respect that. Combat experience is important. But, still, unless she's some kind of special forces super soldier, I think the fundamentals still apply. Sarah had to suppress a laugh.
She wondered what Martinez would think if he knew he was talking to someone who had spent 6 months embedded with Delta Force operators, who had personally led raids against high-value targets, who had earned her 3rd Bronze Star for actions under fire that had saved the lives of 12 soldiers.
We'll see, she said diplomatically.
The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Martinez growing increasingly animated as he described his fighting background and his theories about combat effectiveness. He wasn't entirely wrong about some things. Physical strength and speed were certainly advantages in hand-to-hand combat. But his complete dismissal of factors like training, experience, tactical thinking, and mental toughness revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what real combat actually involved. Sarah found herself genuinely curious about how this would play out. She hadn't been in a real physical confrontation since a bar fight 3 years ago when she was still a colonel, visiting soldiers on leave in Germany. 3 drunk locals had decided that a female officer drinking alone was an easy target. They had been extremely wrong about that assessment. There she is now, Sarah said suddenly, pointing toward the base entrance.
The recruits all turned to look, scanning the area for the female officer they expected to see approaching.
They looked confused when they saw only the same military personnel who had been moving through the area all morning.
Where? Martinez asked, still scanning the crowd.
Right here, Sarah said quietly. The realization dawned on them slowly, like sunrise breaking over mountains.
Peterson's face went white. Thompson's eyes widened in shock and, then, narrowed in anticipation of the spectacle to come. Martinez's confident expression slowly transformed into one of dawning horror as the implications hit him.
You're... He started to say, his voice barely above a whisper. General Sarah Mitchell, she said formally, her voice carrying the full weight of command authority for the first time since arriving. And, I believe you had some theories about female officers you wanted to discuss.
The silence that followed Sarah's introduction stretched like a taut wire ready to snap.
Martinez's face cycled through several shades of pale as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He had just spent 20 minutes explaining to a 3-star general why female officers were inferior fighters, completely unaware that he was speaking to one of the most decorated combat veterans on the base.
Peterson looked like he might faint.
Thompson covered her face with her hands, though whether from embarrassment or to hide a smile was unclear. Several other soldiers who had been drawn by the conversation suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, melting away from what was clearly about to become a legendary moment in base history. "General Mitchell," Martinez stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to come to attention. His movements were jerky, uncertain, as if his body couldn't decide whether to salute, run, or simply cease to exist.
I didn't know. Ma'am,
Sarah held up a hand, her expression remaining neutral but her eyes sharp and focused. Years of command had taught her the value of strategic silence. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader could do was simply wait and let the other person fully comprehend their situation. "At ease, recruit," she said finally, though her tone suggested anything but relaxation. "I think we were in the middle of an interesting discussion about military effectiveness and combat capability."
You seemed quite confident in your assessments.
Martinez's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The confident young man who had been holding court about his fighting prowess just minutes earlier now looked like a deer caught in headlights. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air.
"Ma'am, I was just..."
He started, then stopped, clearly realizing that any explanation would only dig him deeper into the hole he had already created.
"You were just what?"
Sarah asked, her voice carrying the deceptive calm that experienced soldiers knew preceded a storm.
"Please, continue."
"I'm very interested in your theories about how combat experience and training can overcome certain biological limitations." Thompson stepped forward slightly, clearly wrestling with whether to intervene or let Martinez face the consequences of his own words. Peterson had gone so pale that Sarah briefly worried he might actually pass out. "General Mitchell," Thompson said carefully, "I want you to know that Martinez doesn't speak for all of us. Some of us have great respect for female officers and their contributions to the military."
Sarah nodded approvingly at Thompson's intervention.
Leadership meant recognizing when someone was trying to do the right thing, even in a difficult situation.
"I appreciate that, Thompson. But I'm still curious about Martinez's perspective."
After all, he seemed very certain about his conclusions. She turned back to Martinez, who was now standing rigidly at attention, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder.
"You mentioned that you've been training martial arts since you were 12. That's impressive dedication.
You also said you'd never met a woman who could match what you can do.
I'm curious, how many women with extensive military combat training have you actually fought?"
"None, ma'am," Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible.
"I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Could you speak up?" "None, ma'am,"
Martinez said louder, his voice cracking with stress. "Interesting," Sarah mused, beginning to pace slowly in front of the group. It was a technique she had learned early in her career. Movement created psychological pressure and kept people off balance.
"So your assessment of female combat effectiveness is based on what exactly? High school wrestling? Bar fights? Video games?"
"Ma'am, I made a mistake," Martinez said desperately. "I spoke without thinking, and I said things that were disrespectful and wrong."
"I apologize completely."
Sarah stopped pacing and studied the young recruit carefully. She could see genuine remorse in his eyes, but also the fear of someone who knew he had stepped far over a line. The question was whether this was a teachable moment or whether Martinez was simply trying to escape consequences.
"An apology is a good start," she said. "But I'm still curious about something.
You said you'd be confident facing any female officer on this base in a hypothetical situation where rank didn't matter.
Were you being honest about that confidence, or were you just showing off for your friends?" Martinez's jaw worked silently for several seconds.
Sarah could see him weighing his options: double down on false bravado, try to completely back down, or find some middle ground that might preserve some dignity while acknowledging his error.
I
thought I was being honest, ma'am," he said finally.
"But I realize now that my confidence was based on ignorance.
I don't actually know what female officers are capable of because I've never served with any in combat situations." It was a better answer than Sarah had expected, showing at least some capacity for self-reflection. But she wasn't done with this lesson yet. That's a fair admission, she said. But, let's explore this a bit further. You mentioned respect for the chain of command, but, then, immediately followed it with comments that undermined every female officer's credibility. How do you reconcile those two positions? The question hit home. Martinez's face flushed as he realized the contradiction in his own words. I can't, ma'am. You're right. If I truly respected the chain of command, I wouldn't have questioned whether female officers earned their positions. Good, Sarah said with a slight nod. That's the first step toward real understanding. But, I'm still troubled by something. Your confidence seemed genuine when you thought you were talking to a civilian. It makes me wonder, if I had been wearing my uniform when I walked up, would you have kept those opinions to yourself? The implications of the question hung in the air like smoke. Martinez's eyes widened as he realized what Sarah was really asking. Was he only apologizing because he got caught, or because he genuinely understood why his attitude was wrong? Honestly, ma'am? Martinez said, his voice steadying slightly as he seemed to find his footing in honesty. Probably. I probably would have kept my mouth shut if I'd known you were a general. But, that doesn't make what I said right, and it doesn't make my thinking right. Sarah felt a grudging respect for the young man's willingness to be honest even when it didn't help his situation. Many soldiers would have tried to craft an answer they thought she wanted to hear. You're right, she said. It doesn't. But, your honesty is noted. Now I have another question for you. You seemed very confident about your fighting abilities. Have you ever been in actual combat? No, ma'am. This is my first assignment after basic training and AIT. I see. So your combat experience consists of training scenarios and whatever civilian fighting experience you had before enlisting? Yes, ma'am. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Let me share something with you, Martinez. I've been in combat on 4 different continents. I've led soldiers in firefights, close-quarters combat, and situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for the people under my command. I've killed enemy combatants in hand-to-hand situations, and I've been wounded twice doing it. The words were delivered matter-of-factly, but their impact on the recruits was visible. Even Thompson, who had been defending female officers, looked awed by the casual way Sarah described experiences that were far beyond anything they could imagine. Now, Sarah continued, I'm not telling you this to intimidate you or to prove how tough I am. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something important about military service. The ability to succeed in combat, real combat, where people die, isn't primarily about how much you can bench press or how many fights you won in high school. She gestured toward the base around them, where soldiers of all sizes and backgrounds were going about their duties. Combat effectiveness comes from training, discipline, tactical thinking, the ability to function under extreme stress, and the willingness to put your mission and your fellow soldiers above your own survival. Those qualities have nothing to do with gender. Martinez nodded, seeming to absorb her words genuinely. Yes, ma'am. I understand that now. Do you? Sarah asked. Because understanding it intellectually is different from really believing it. You seemed very certain that physical advantages would trump training and experience. Are you ready to reconsider that assumption? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and Martinez's eyes widened as he realized what she was implying. Peterson made a small choking sound, while Thompson looked back and forth between Martinez and the general with growing anticipation. Ma'am? Martinez said uncertainly. You said you'd be confident facing any female officer on this base in a hypothetical situation, Sarah said, her voice taking on a slightly predatory edge. Well, here I am. Still feeling confident? The gathering crowd of soldiers suddenly seemed to lean in collectively, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Word was spreading rapidly through the nearby areas that something significant was happening at the base entrance, and more personnel were finding reasons to walk past. Martinez looked like he wished the ground would open up and swallow him. Ma'am, I would never. I mean, you're a general, and I'm not talking about rank, Sarah interrupted, echoing Martinez's earlier words back to him. You said in a hypothetical situation where rank didn't matter, just skill against skill.
You said you'd be confident. Were you telling the truth?
The trap was perfect, and everyone present could see it.
Martinez had backed himself into a corner where any answer would be problematic.
If he admitted he wouldn't be confident fighting a general, he was admitting his earlier bravado was empty. If he maintained his confidence, he was essentially challenging a superior officer to a fight. Martinez started, then stopped, clearly realizing there was no good way forward. Let me help you out, Sarah said with what might have been mercy or might have been the setup for an even bigger trap.
What if we made it fair? What if we removed all the advantages you think I might have? Ma'am, I don't understand, Martinez said weakly.
Simple, Sarah said, beginning to remove her jacket. You mentioned earlier that desk jockeys don't know real combat, implying that officers like me have gone soft sitting behind computers. You also mentioned physical advantages being decisive. So let's test your theory. The crowd was growing larger now, with soldiers stopping their morning routines to witness what was clearly becoming a legendary confrontation. Sarah could see officers beginning to appear at the edges of the gathering, drawn by reports that something unusual was happening involving a general and some recruits. Ma'am, Thompson said urgently, maybe this isn't the best way to handle this situation.
Sarah looked at the young woman approvingly. You're probably right, Thompson.
The professional thing would be to report Martinez's comments through the proper channels and let his chain of command deal with his attitude problem. But sometimes the most educational approach isn't the most professional one. She turned back to Martinez, who was now sweating profusely despite the cool morning air.
What do you think, recruit? Ready to test your theories against someone with actual combat experience? Or are you starting to realize that maybe your assumptions need some adjustment?
Martinez stood frozen, caught between the impossible choice of backing down completely or facing the consequences of his earlier boasting. The crowd around them had grown to include several dozen soldiers, and Sarah could see officers pushing through the gathering, clearly concerned about what was developing at the base entrance.
General Mitchell.
A familiar voice cut through the tension. Colonel James Harper, her old colleague from her days as a battalion commander, emerged from the crowd with the purposeful stride of someone trying to prevent a career-ending situation.
Ma'am, perhaps we should discuss whatever's happening here in a more appropriate setting.
Sarah turned to acknowledge Harper, noting the concern in his eyes. She had served with him in Afghanistan and respected his judgment, but she also sensed that this moment had educational value that extended far beyond one cocky recruit's attitude adjustment. Colonel Harper, she said formally. I'm conducting an informal assessment of recruit attitudes regarding military leadership and effectiveness.
It's proving quite enlightening.
Harper's eyes flicked between Sarah, the obviously distressed Martinez, and the growing crowd of spectators. As a seasoned officer, he could read the tactical situation clearly. This was either going to become a legendary teaching moment or a disciplinary nightmare, depending on how it played out. I see, he said carefully. Perhaps I could assist with this assessment? Actually, Sarah said, making a decision that would reshape her approach, that's an excellent idea. Martinez here has some theories about combat effectiveness that I think would benefit from a broader perspective. She turned back to the recruit, who looked like he was praying for divine intervention. Martinez, you seemed concerned that female officers lack practical combat experience. Colonel Harper commanded a combat battalion in Syria. Why don't you ask him about the female officers who served under his command? Harper caught on immediately, his expression shifting to one of grim amusement. Well, Martinez, since you're interested in combat effectiveness, let me tell you about Captain Lisa Rodriguez. 5'4", 120 pounds soaking wet. She led a platoon that held off a coordinated enemy assault for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. Killed 12 enemy combatants in close quarters fighting, including 2 in hand-to-hand combat. Martinez's face grew even paler as Harper continued. Then, there was Major Jennifer Kim. She went into a collapsed building under fire to pull out 3 wounded soldiers. Had to fight her way through enemy positions to do it. Or Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who took out an enemy sniper nest single-handedly when her squad was pinned down. Those officers, Harper said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen heroes made and lost, saved more lives and showed more courage under fire than most of the male soldiers I've commanded. And every one of them was tougher than any recruit I've ever met. Sarah watched Martinez absorb this information, seeing his certainty crumble as real combat experience contradicted his assumptions. But she wasn't finished with the lesson yet. Colonel Harper raises an interesting point, she said. But Martinez was specifically concerned about physical confrontations. He seemed to think that superior strength and speed would be decisive factors. What's your experience with that assumption? Harper's smile was sharp as a blade. Funny you should ask. I remember a particular incident during joint training exercises with special operations. Some of our male soldiers made similar assumptions about a female Delta Force operator. They were convinced that her success was due to lower standards or special treatment. The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing that they were hearing a story that would be repeated for years to come. Even the officers who had been trying to manage the situation seemed content to let Harper continue. This operator, can't give you her real name, but let's call her Shadow, decided to provide a practical demonstration of why assumptions can be dangerous. She challenged the three most vocal skeptics to individual sparring matches. Martinez made a small sound that might have been a whimper. First guy was 6'3", 240 pounds, former college wrestler. Shadow put him down in less than 30 seconds without breaking a sweat. Second guy was a former Marine boxer, thought he was hot stuff. Lasted maybe 45 seconds before he was tapping out. Third guy was smart enough to apologize and back down after watching his buddies get schooled. Harper turned to look directly at Martinez. The lesson, recruit, is that real combat isn't about who's strongest or fastest. It's about who's best trained, who thinks fastest under pressure, and who's willing to do whatever it takes to win. And, let me tell you something, the women who make it through combat selection are usually tougher and more determined than their male counterparts, because they had to be to get there. Sarah nodded approvingly. Excellent points, Colonel. But, I'm still curious about Martinez's original confidence. He seemed quite certain that he could handle any female officer on this base. Martinez, after hearing Colonel Harper's experiences, are you still feeling confident about that assessment? Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, but, to his credit, he straightened his shoulders and met Sarah's gaze directly. No, ma'am. I was wrong, and I was ignorant, and I'm honestly ashamed of what I said. I have no business making assumptions about anyone's combat effectiveness based on their gender. It was a good answer, showing genuine remorse and understanding. But Sarah had one more test in mind. That's a significant improvement in your thinking, she said. But I'm curious about something. If you truly understand that your assumptions were wrong, would you be willing to put that understanding to a practical test? Ma'am? Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected where this was heading. Simple, Sarah said. You were confident you could outfight any female officer on this base. I'm offering you the chance to test that theory against actual reality instead of your assumptions. The crowd stirred with anticipation and concern. Harper stepped forward slightly, clearly wondering if he should intervene, but Sarah held up a hand to forestall him. Now, before anyone gets excited, she said, raising her voice to address the growing audience, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about hazing or humiliation. This is about education. Martinez made statements based on ignorance and prejudice, and sometimes the best way to correct ignorance is through direct experience. She looked back at Martinez, who was now visibly trembling. So here's your choice, recruit. You can accept that your assumptions were wrong based on the testimony of experienced combat veterans, or you can test those assumptions against reality. Either way is acceptable, but I want you to make a conscious choice about what you believe and why. Martinez stood silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision. Sarah could see the internal battle playing out across his face, pride warring with fear, stubborn ego fighting against growing wisdom. Ma'am, he said finally, his voice steadier than Sarah had expected, I choose to trust the experience and judgment of you and Colonel Harper. I don't need to get my ass kicked to understand that I was wrong. I was ignorant, and I spoke from prejudice instead of knowledge, and I'm sorry for that. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the young man. It would have been easy to double down on false bravado or to accept her challenge out of wounded pride. Instead, he had chosen the harder path of genuinely examining his beliefs and admitting error. "Outstanding," she said, and her smile was genuinely warm for the first time since the conversation began. "That shows real maturity and the kind of thinking we need from our soldiers." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Let me take this opportunity to make something clear to everyone present. The military is stronger when we judge people by their abilities, their dedication, and their results, not by superficial characteristics or outdated assumptions. Every officer, every NCO, every soldier on this base earned their position through merit, regardless of their gender, race, or background." The crowd murmured agreement, though Sarah could see that her words were hitting home with more than just Martinez. Several young soldiers in the gathering looked thoughtful, clearly reconsidering their own assumptions. "Martinez," she said, turning back to the recruit, "you've shown that you can learn from your mistakes and adjust your thinking when presented with new information. That's an essential quality for any soldier. But I want you to understand something important: this conversation doesn't end here." Martinez's expression grew concerned again. "Ma'am?" "You're going to be working alongside female soldiers throughout your career," Sarah explained. "Some of them will be your peers, some will be your subordinates, and some will be your superiors. Your success, and sometimes your survival, will depend on your ability to work effectively with all of them, regardless of any preconceptions you might have." She gestured toward Thompson, who had been watching the entire exchange with intense interest. "Thompson here tried to warn you about your attitude problem. A smart soldier would have listened to that warning. In combat, the soldier next to you might be the one who saves your life, regardless of their gender. Can you handle that reality?" "Yes, ma'am," Martinez said firmly. "I understand, and I'll do better." "Good," Sarah said. "Because I'm going to be watching your development with interest. You've shown that you can learn, but real change requires consistent effort over time." Colonel Harper stepped forward. "Ma'am, if I may suggest, perhaps Martinez would benefit from some additional perspective on military history and the contributions of female service members." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Excellent suggestion, Colonel. Martinez, you're going to spend your off-duty time for the next month researching the history of women in combat. I want detailed reports on significant contributions, from Deborah Sampson in the Revolutionary War to current special operations personnel. Think of it as remedial education." "Yes, ma'am," Martinez said, though he looked relieved that his punishment was educational rather than punitive. "And, Martinez?" Sarah added, her voice carrying a hint of steel. "If I hear of you making similar comments about any soldier on this base, male or female, we'll revisit this conversation. And, next time, I won't be nearly as patient." The threat was clear, and Martinez nodded vigorously. "Understood, ma'am. It won't happen again." Sarah turned to address the crowd one final time. "This has been an educational morning for all of us. Remember what you've witnessed here: assumptions based on prejudice can be dangerous and costly. Judge your fellow soldiers by their actions, their competence, and their character. Nothing else matters." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed several female soldiers approaching Martinez, clearly intending to